Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to today's event with Charles Delllheim, discussing his latest book, Belonging and Betrayal, How Jews Made the Art World Modern, in conversation with Jonathan Petropoulos. Today's event is part of Harvard Bookstore's newly returned Friday Forum series, which takes place on Friday afternoons during the academic year as a way to highlight scholarly books in a wide range of fields. Though we remain digital for the time being, we have a full schedule of virtual events in the coming weeks as part of this afternoon series and others. Next Friday afternoon, York University's Andil Gosin joins us for a discussion of his book, Nature's Wild, Love, Sex, and Law in the Caribbean, in conversation with Brandeis's own Faith Smith. For today's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you'd like to ask the speakers something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all of your questions. We will get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat function of this presentation, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your copy of Belonging and Betrayal. If you already have a copy of or would like to contribute to this series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you're able to extend to us at this time. Please note that closed captioning is available for this broadcast. Depending on which version of Zoom you are using, you may need to enable it yourself. Simply locate the button marked CC Live Transcript on your display and click through the options. And one final note, as you may know from large virtual gatherings we've all been attending this past year, technical issues might come up. We do apologize in advance for that. If any technical glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Charles Delllheim is Professor of History and Director of the Keeler-Shand Honors College at Boston University. His previous publications, including The Face of the Past, The Preservation of the Medieval Inheritance in Victorian England, and The Disenchanted Isle, Mrs. Thatcher's Capitalist Revolution, explore facets of modern British cultural history. For his scholarship, he has been awarded numerous honors and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Harvard University, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Littauer Foundation. Today, he is joined in conversation by Jonathan Petropoulos, an internationally recognized expert on Nazi art looting and the John B. Croul Professor of European History at Claremont McKenna College. His previous publications include Artists Under Hitler, Collaboration and Survival in Nazi Germany, and Goring's Man in Paris, the story of a Nazi art plunderer and his world, released to wonderful reviews at the beginning of this year. This afternoon, they'll be discussing Professor Delllheim's latest book, Belonging and Betrayal, How Jews Made the Art World Modern, a brilliant account of the community of Jewish art dealers and connoisseurs whose collections, later pillaged by Nazis, transformed the art world on both sides of the Atlantic. Since the fate of the Nazi stolen art first entered the cultural imagination, much has been brilliantly said about the ongoing process and consequences of restitution. But where, in the first place, did the art come from? And what about the community of tastemakers who accrued such influential coffers? I will end with praise from Hebrew University's Richard I. Cohen, who calls Belonging and Betrayal a major contribution to understanding a profound Jewish goal to belong and succeed, only to be betrayed by willful acts by Nazis and their collaborators. This impressive book will engage you, surprise you, anger you, and above all, enrich you. We're so excited to be hosting this event this afternoon. Without further ado, I'm now delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is all yours, Professor Delllheim and Professor Petropoulos.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you for that introduction. And let's see, we'll get Charles up on the screen here. One second.
I'm here, Jonathan. I'm not sure.
You see me? Oh, there you are. Perfect. There you go. Excellent. Hey, hi, Charles. So, what an honor, what a treat to discuss your extraordinary book. Guys, first of all, I want to say it is such a handsome book. And Brandeis University Press did an extraordinary job with the layout and the illustrations, how you got all those color plates in there. Congratulations. And it's one of the most handsome books I've seen. It's also a kind of epic book, right? It comes in at about 586 pages of text and some end notes there. And it's really sweeping, and there's a grandeur to it. And so I think my first question is a kind of a two-part question for you. I mean, do you consider this to be your magnum opus? Tell us about the gestation period. And it seems like a big book that you worked a long time on. And the second question is, tell us a little bit more about the title, about belonging and betrayal. And I found an earlier CV of yours, and at one point the project was called Acquiring Eyes, Jews, Art, and Modernism. And so you changed to Belonging and Betrayal, How Jews Made the Art World Modern. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, first, thanks so much to all of you for coming, and very special thanks to Jonathan. There's no one I've learned more from about Nazi stolen art in the German art world, and I welcome the chance for the two of us to talk coast to coast as it happens. So magnum opus, wow, that's a heavy title, and luckily that's something for other people to decide about. Wait till you see the next two volumes. Just kidding. There are no two volumes. If there were two more volumes of this book, I'm not sure what my wife Laura, who's also my agent, would do or not do. It is a book I worked on for a long time. Ironically, it was supposed to be a short book executed in a short period of time, and it fell short on both counts. Part of it was that the research, which maybe we'll talk about in due course, was very extensive, in part because once I decided to frame the book as a narrative about the rise and fall of this extraordinary circle of art dealers, collectors, and artists from the late 19th century, really up until the present, but especially through the Second World War, it was difficult to figure out how to tell the story in terms of weaving in and out the lives of the characters, but also providing a rich historical backdrop to make clear what kind of world they were coming from. And I think without which you really can't understand their fortunes and misfortunes. Just one other point about this: as a graduate student, I remember reading a book by my teacher in England, Asa Briggs, Victorian Cities, which is a great book and part of a trilogy. And the book begins with what I considered to be an odd line at the time. And the line read, "This book is the product of many years of research." I no longer consider that line at all odd or strange. As for the title, well, I have to say that when I wasn't able to write or wasn't writing anything good, I did one or two things. I changed titles, or in even more desperation, I would just press select all and change the font. That made me feel that I had done something better, at least for the moment. So Belonging and Betrayal, it's about two fundamental human experiences, which I look at in a very specific historic frame from the later 19th century to the present, but more broadly in the context of the gradual opening of European high culture and the political and legal emancipation of Jews. So why belonging? Well, I think during the pandemic, I think all of us have seen time and again the importance of affiliation, of connection, of the sense of belonging to a particular group. That, I think, is universal. What's particular about it for Jews during the 19th and early 20th century is these are people who have achieved a degree of political and legal emancipation. It's a gradual piecemeal process, but they can't count on being considered respectable. They can't count on social acceptance. And this quest for affiliation is really about finding a role in what Henrik Ibsen called the compact majority, which is one of Freud's famous phrases. And speaking of phrases, to take off on Heinrich Heine, Heine talked about conversion, baptism as a passport to civilization. And there were many Jews who were unwilling to go that far. And art offered a kind of surrogate means of acculturation and acceptance, immersion in the aesthetic traditions in Europe, but also the opportunity to remake those traditions. Betrayal. Well, the social contract of emancipation, of acculturation, runs something like this. Change your ways, change your dress, change your language, accept our manners and morals, cleave to our national traditions, be good citizens, and we will accept you. Now, that happens more or less at various times, but in the 1920s and 30s is one of the periods in which we begin to see a furious backlash. This is really a time in which the dealers and collectors that I write about have suddenly, almost out of nowhere, come to prominence in the art world. And visibility bred vulnerability. These are people who were trafficking in significant symbols, and their incursions into what had been a realm dominated by non-Jews either created or became a pretext for a backlash by competitors who did not want them to be part of the art world. And this played upon an old vein in anti-Semitism, which you can see from Richard Wagner onwards, the idea that Jews were unable to appreciate beauty. They were simply imitators and not creators. And of course, what this culminates in tragically, the great betrayal, as I believe you call it, is this violent onslaught by the Nazis, who stripped Jews of their citizenship, stripped Jews of their art, but while heaping contempt on so-called Jewish taste, in very, very big quotes, they expropriate Jewish-owned art collections, and particularly the Northern Old Masters like Rembrandt.
Yeah. Great answer. Thank you. You know, the length of your book, it reminds me a little bit of what I've experienced when I've written about Nazi art plundering. And all of my books have been tree killers, if you will. They've been long books. And I say, you know, the Nazis stole so much from so many people on such a vast geographical expanse. It's difficult to write a short book about this subject. And with you talking about Jewish individuals in the art world, you know, there are so many really incredibly important figures in your book. I mean, just amongst the dealers, we can talk about the Duvines, who had a towering position in the first half of the 20th century, the Wildensteins, and you do a great job, comprehensive on the Wildenstein, Monsieur Georges, and they're so important, especially for the second half. And you have Paul Rosenberg and Alfred Flechtheim and the Gimpels and the Cassiers and the Bernheims and the Kahnweilers and on and on. And you see, it's such an incredible cohort. So I can see why it's such a rich book in that way. What were some of the factors leading up to the kind of emergence of these important Jewish dealers? What happened in the art world, you know, commercially too, maybe even broader in society, that created this moment where these Jewish dealers were so important?
It's a great question. In the broadest sense, this is part of the gradual opening of high culture. I mean, art was traditionally the preserve of princes, nobles, churchmen, and most art was to be found in royal courts, in palaces and villas and country houses. And in the course of the 18th century, this begins to change. And John Brewer has shown this in his fantastic book, Pleasures of the Imagination, where he talks about the movement from the court to the city and especially to the metropolis. And the first real sign of this is the proliferation of museums. And, as you know, museums have had more than their share of criticism lately, some justified, perhaps. Actually, some justified, certainly, but it's also important to remember that without public museums, the rest of us do not get to see great works of art from different civilizations. So that's the general backdrop. Within the art world itself, there are two critical changes that take place in the late 19th century. And, while historians will always debate when does the modern world begin, most of us will talk about the French and industrial revolutions and the coming of democracy and of a more than industrial society as once and for all changes, though there are some kind of reversals too. In the art world, there are two equivalents of this in terms of the decline and fall of the old order. And the first refers to the role of the aristocracy. So following the examples of kings, Charles I, who had a great art collection, but did not live to see it long, thanks to the Puritans and to Oliver Cromwell. Nobles in his court are taking up this fashion for art collecting. And this isn't simply a matter of acquiring things or slapping something on a wall. Connoisseurship is central to this, and in the grand tours of the 18th century, aristocrats go off to the continent, especially to England, and this coincides with some very rough times for Florentine and Venetian nobles who happen to be the predominant owners of Leonardo's, Raphael's, Titian's, Tintoretto's, and many other great old masters, and they begin to sell. So these aristocrats all over Europe become great patrons of art, and they exercise a dominant influence in the art world. In the late 19th century, this begins to change, and to change precipitously. There's a financial crisis. Agricultural income falls. Land values falls. And at the same time, taxes go up and death duties. And as anyone who has seen Downton Abbey knows, that when the state passes from one generation to the next, there are often great complications. So as a result of this, these aristocrats in Britain and elsewhere on the continent need to sell assets that are disposable. And whether it's cattle or townhouses or cases upon cases of clarets, they need to raise money. And some of their most valuable assets were these family art collections, either those acquired on their ancestors on the Grand Tour, or commissioned by, say, Reynolds or Gainsborough, or one of the other greats who portrayed the ladies and gentlemen of country society. So there's a vast sell-off, and this vast sell-off means that paintings, sculptures, decorative art that would not have been available under any other circumstances and had not been available for at least a century goes on the block. And as Henry James says, Europe had art, America had money. And let me add to that, that the Jewish dealers that I write about, especially the Duvines, had a lot of chutzpah. And that chutzpah allowed them to bridge the gap. So who are they selling to? Well, they're engineering this transfer of a massive quantity of really great paintings, sculptures, decorative objects from Europe to America. And the people who are most interested in this are the capitalist new rich, whether it was people who made their money in finance, like J.P. Morgan, in steel, like H.C. Frick, or Isabella Stewart Gardner, who happened to be born to the right father, though she didn't have quite as much money. And the people that I write about are bridging the gap between Europe and America. And the reason this is important is that without this disruption of the old order and the changing balance of power, the fading away of the aristocrats as a cultural force, Jews never would have had an opening. So that's one side of the story with Old Masters. The other side of the story is about contemporary art. And this is really a story about what happens to the dominant art institutions of the day, like the Academy of Fine Arts, which goes back to Louis XIV, 1648, which trained artists and set aesthetic standards, and then to the salon, which became increasingly important in the 18th century and the 19th century. These are the places in which artists showcase their work, but only if they pass muster with juries. And because the juries were so dedicated to certain forms of history painting, mythological scenes, battle scenes, some landscapes, some portraits of the great, they were by and large unwilling to accommodate new forms of aesthetic expression, the painting of modern life, pioneered by Edouard Manet and his followers, the Impressionists. So these people find themselves cut off from established networks. And there's no evidence that they wanted to sell outside of the salon or that they wanted to transform the art market. They wanted to be able to make a living. And to do this, they have to turn to entrepreneurial dealers, some Jews, some non-Jews, people who were philosophically committed to their art, but who were also willing to take a risk on it. And one other thing is that when it comes to the new schools of modern art, whether we're talking Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Symbolism, Futurism, or perhaps most strikingly, Cubism, you need to find ways to explain to collectors, to critics, what this new art is about, that it's not simply violating the rules of perspective or traditional subjects. And that means that the dealers especially take on a critical role as interpreters. So those are the two big openings.
Oh, thank you. What a great answer. I wish you were in my class this week. I was teaching at Claremont McKenna College, Cynthia Saltzman's book, Old Masters, New World. And you've elaborated and built on her work and put it in a different context. And, you know, in reading her book, one doesn't really understand the role of Jewish dealers in this transfer of cultural property, because it is monumental when you see, you know, I think David Cannadine says 79 country houses were torn down and liquidated, and almost half the old masters from Britain ended up in America. And when you look at Mellon and Frick and the others buying on an industrial scale, but you know the role of these European dealers who come to America, as you noted, and then sometimes very often the Jewish dealers is really significant. But I also, and it's interesting with the dealers. The Jewish dealers, very often they started with old masters like Nathan Wildenstein and then his son George, or the Duvines, and then they evolved, many of them, into modern and contemporary art. And do you think there's a special affinity for these Jewish dealers and modern art that we should pay attention to? Because they seem to have a real important impact on the artists and the work that's made. Maybe thinking of modern art as distinct from old masters and such, you know, what's the intervention of these Jewish players in terms of the modern art scene?
Well, they're different but related stories, and the backdrop to this is that understanding that, you know, as we know, Jews traditionally were the people of the book who were more fixed on literary texts than on visual images. And a problematic part of the visual image is that they are suffused with Christian icons, which to Jews were fearsome. They were sources of anxiety. They were part of a culture that they believed had excluded or oppressed them. And there's some of this is a role of accident. Nathan Wildenstein, son of an Alsatian horse dealer, ends up in a small town in Champagne, has never been to a museum. And in 1875, a client comes to him with a picture. Can you sell it? Well, Nathan was a remarkable salesman. He could sell anything. He was also a very poor man. He needed the money and he troops off to Paris. And for 10 days, he basically locks himself in the Louvre. And there he has a kind of secular conversion experience among these heavenly delights. And he's able to figure out that the painting comes from the school of Van Dyck. Now, how he did this is beyond me. There is something about these people. They all have astonishing eyes. Berenson comes from a shtetl in Russia, in which there is virtually no art. Comes to Boston, poor immigrant boy, goes to Harvard. He's lionized by Boston Brahmin society, in part because of his intellectual gifts and in part because, as his future wife, Mary Smith, said when she saw him in Harvard Yard, he was a beautiful and mysterious youth, very handsome, attractive to men and women. And he goes to Europe after graduation. And he is just overwhelmed by the art that he comes into contact with. So there's a role of contingency, but I think you're right. With modern art, there's something special going on. And part of it is there's a larger pattern that this passion for modern art, or the entry into modern art, there's a lot of resemblance to Jewish economic and cultural activity in other spheres. As a way of escaping discrimination, Jews tended to cluster in new and rapidly expanding fields where they could take advantage of ethnic networks, where they had scope for international trading, but where also they could get in on the ground floor. There were no established hierarchies, and there was limited competition. The other thing is that most of these people have very, very limited capital. They do not have the kind of fortunes or anything like the fortunes that J.P. Morgan has or the great New York department store owner Benjamin Altman has. So money is a factor here, especially because in 1901, as you know, you could pick up a gouache by Pablo Picasso for what is now an insanely low price. So let me give you one example. Daniel Henri Kahnweiler, German Jew, born in the Rhineland-Palatinate in Mannheim, about 15 minutes from where my own family was born, in the small town of Mutterstadt. His family is involved in finance and in stockbroking. He's a good student, but does not go off to university. He does what his parents ask him to do rather reluctantly and trains in finance. He ends up in Paris and he's working for a stockbroking firm. He has a very generous and understanding boss. And at noon, when the bell rang at the boss and everyone went for lunch, he began to scour the museums. And this was his artistic education. And Kahnweiler is absolutely typical of the people I deal with because he is self-taught. His education is the product of his own reading and his own seeing. He goes off to the Luxembourg and he happens on a small room which contains the Caillebotte collection. And Gustav Caillebotte, great impressionist painter, and who came from a well-to-do and privileged family and who collected the works of his friends. And he sees these impressionist paintings and he is attracted by them, but he can't decipher them. He doesn't know at first what he's looking at. And for him, this was a really valuable experience because in the end, when he's working with Picasso and the Cubists, he's faced with these radically subversive, dissolving forms. In the portrait of Kahnweiler that Picasso does in 1910, you do not see a person traditionally portrayed. You see a watch fob, a mustache, a vest, an African mask. Even Kahnweiler's mother wouldn't have been able to recognize him. But I think in terms of the affinity for modern art, Jews were competing with non-Jews on an equal playing field. that is the fact that these people had no role in the world of old masters or in the larger power structure of old Europe really doesn't matter. And I think one of the attractions is the attraction of experimentation, of going into new fields. And very often, because old fields were full. I mean, you see this in physics. Why were there so many Jews who in theoretical physics? Well, because experimental physics was a German non-Jewish preserve, and there was no room. And this new physics offered opportunities. And there's something of the same intellectual and aesthetic excitement with art. The other thing is that for Kahnweiler and for other Jews, immersing themselves in modern art, whether it's Fauvist or Surrealist or Futurist or Cubist, has another advantage. That is, it gives them entree into the world of the avant-garde, into a social community in which what matters is not, or at least less, your ethnic origins, your religious origins, your class affiliations, but your taste, your commitments. So that's part of a very complicated story.
I'm also reminded of Arno Mayer's important work from the early 1980s, The Persistence of the Old Regime, where this very polemical book he acknowledges, where he argues for the persistence of historicist high culture and points out that modernism was really found only in cities, in a few pockets in the period before World War I, right? And that if you went to the provincial towns like Linz, where Hitler grew up, for example, there was very little modernism. So in the big cities like Vienna and Munich and Berlin and such, where there were Jewish populations, that's where the modernist artists were to be found. But again, it was really tough sledding before World War I and selling these works. I'm also reminded of the line of one of your teachers, professors, Peter Gay, The Outsider as Insider, right? The subtitle of his Weimar culture book. So people like Alfred Flesheim, who you write about brilliantly, they become insiders in the Weimar Republic, right? And they really help shape the dynamic culture of Weimar, of interwar Europe. And tell us a little bit more about Flesheim too, because he's such an important figure and he's such a subject of criticism for the Nazis. He's really one of their enemies, their public enemies there. But tell us about Flesheim's role and then later his tribulations.
Yeah, he is one of my absolute favorite characters. He's this warm-hearted, exuberant, expansive man, tall and stocky, full of vitality. And I'm not sure if he smoked more cigars than Churchill or Freud, but he was certainly up there, and it's no accident that he was always portrayed with a cigar. He was a bon vivant, but he was born to a rather sober family. He's born to a family of grain merchants. Again, that's a link to my own family, who were grain merchants, as well as horse dealers, though on a much more modest scale, I'm afraid. And he's trained to take over the family business. He sees this as an honorable occupation, and he takes over a business which is in reasonable shape, but there are some problems. He marries a young Jewish woman from a prosperous family named Betty Goldschmidt. They go to Paris on their honeymoon, and in Paris, with her permission, and she was awfully generous, he begins to buy modern art. He falls in love with modern art, and he becomes part of this circle around the Café du Dôme, which is one of the great bohemian hangouts in Montparnasse in the early 20th century. And there he meets fellow German immigrants, Willy Ude, who'd come from a very proper German background. His father was a judge. He was supposed to become a lawyer, and he ends up studying art history and goes to Paris, where he puts together a remarkable collection of art, including Picasso's, and then eventually, at least for a short time, opens a gallery. But the most important person he meets is Kahnweiler. And, Kahnweiler was someone who distanced himself from his own bourgeois background. He claimed to have been utterly bored working for his uncles, the Neumanns, in London. And as it happened, they were art collectors, but he turned up his nose at what they collected. They were Reynoldses and Gainsboroughs. That was not good enough for young Monsieur Kahnweiler. And Kahnweiler is starting out, and he is trying to find artists whose work he can afford. He loves Cézanne, but by then Cézanne's prices have gone too high. And when he and Flestheim meet, they hit it off almost immediately, though you could not find two more different people. Kahnweiler was very buttoned up. Flestheim was bursting his buttons in every way. And then the challenge for Flestheim is how's he going to get out of the grain business and become an art dealer? And this is quite a saga, and it almost ends very badly. He thinks of committing suicide in the hope that the insurance money will pay off his debts, because for the Fleshtheims, as for Mons Buddenbrooks, nothing is worse than bankruptcy. But with the help of some friends, he's able to go into art dealing and collecting, and one of the first Germans to do so in and around Dusseldorf. And this is right before the war. Well, when the war comes, he enlists, becomes an officer, has what used to be called a good war. But his business is ruined, and he has nothing left in terms of a gallery. So with the help of Paul Cassira, another of the great figures who I write about and who was the leading champion of modernism in Germany, Flestheim gets started again. And then he comes roaring back. He opens galleries in Berlin, Dusseldorf, Frankfurt, Cologne. He takes a share of a gallery in Vienna. And he works with the greatest artists of the day, not only the French avant-garde, but also with the German expressionists. And as you say, during the Weimar Republic, this is an outsider who becomes an insider. But he's an outsider or insider who has gone well over his budget in a way that his grain merchant ancestors would have warned him about. So just as quickly as he opens new galleries, within a few years, partly because of the inflation and then because of the depression, he is selling. But as you say, he becomes a symbol to the Nazis of Jewish perfidy, of Jewish decadence, the purveyor of degenerate art. And a couple of days before the Nazi boycott of Jewish-owned businesses on April 1st, 1933, an exhibition that he's planning is bombed. And this is a message that he does not ignore, but he has to find a way out. And it was difficult for him to do so. Can he leave? Can his wife, Betty, come with him? Does he have to liquidate his assets? And he's able to liquidate the assets. And what's interesting about this story in terms of the dispossessions that takes place later is that Flestheim was on quite good terms with his liquidator, in part because he believed that the liquidator was saving him from the disgrace of bankruptcy, in part because he knew that he had to get out of Germany, and he ends up in Britain in the mid-1930s in London. And he's part of this incredibly creative wave of Jewish artistic and intellectual refugees. And he teams up with Douglas Cooper, a connoisseur about whom you know a great deal, who later becomes very involved in the retrieval of art. And he makes a big splash in the art scene. But on a larger level, what he shows is the pattern that I show throughout the book. Someone who starts out in a much more ordinary trade, in this case, grain dealing, falls in love with modern art, embraces it, as much for aesthetic reasons as for any other reasons, and then suffers this catastrophic fall. He's endlessly fascinating.
Yeah. So, and I hadn't realized until you pointed it out that his wife Betty Flesheim, who dies tragically, she commits suicide before she's deported. Supposed to be deported to the east, to a camp in the east, but I hadn't realized that she had come to London at the time of his death in 1937, and she was out of Germany, of Nazi Germany, and why did she go back? It's so, and so you have this wonderfully textured treatment of all of these figures, and it's such a service for those of us who've been working on these figures. We still learn things in your book. You've really pulled together the elements there. I'm going to leave some time for questions for the audience too. This book is so rich, and I mentioned some of the dealers that you write about. Similarly, you write about Jewish collectors, starting with the Rothschilds and the Bloch-Bauers, and we could talk endlessly about collectors. I'm very interested in the Mendelssohn-Bartholdy family. Paul von Mendelssohn-Bartholdy, his cousin Robert, and they were great collectors. One could talk about Jewish artists, and you do. Camille Pissarro, the Jewish impressionist, or Modigliani, or Chaim Soutine, Max Liebermann, right? So there's a whole, fascinating cohort of Jewish artists. There are art historians that you mentioned too, many who emigrate to America: Fritz Saxel, Erwin Panofsky, Edgar Wind, Ernst Cassirer. You go down the list of them. And one figure you bring in, who's not European and not part of that emigration, but to me has always been an endlessly fascinating figure, is James Rorimer. And he's kind of a hero for me in many ways too. So tell us a little bit about James Rorimer and how he fits into your story.
Well, he's a remarkable man, and I start the book with James Rorimer. I'm going to the monastery at Buxheim, which is about an hour outside of Munich. And Rorimer was Cleveland born to a German Jewish family. His father, Louis, was a very eminent interior designer. The family was prosperous enough to send James to Europe. He studied in Germany. He studied in Paris at the École Gorée. He studied drawing and painting, and then he goes off to Harvard. And that was a great bit of luck, because one of his parents' friends was a man named Walter Sachs of the great investment bank, Goldman Sachs. And as it happened, Walter Sachs's brother, Paul Sachs, was the leading force in art history at Harvard. He becomes the director of the Fogg Museum. He literally trains a whole generation of art historians, curators, and museum directors, James Rorimer among them. And under Sachs's tutelage, Rorimer studies art history. And then I would imagine with Sachs's help, gets a position at the Metropolitan. He works as a curator of medieval art. And then he has a really big accomplishment, which is creating the Cloisters Museum at the very tip of Manhattan, thanks to the munificence of John D. Rockefeller. So when the war comes, he's a director of the Cloisters. He's under no obligation to fight in the Second World War. America hasn't entered the war. And he's in his mid and then his late 30s. But he's desperate to enlist, and he's first turned away because of a heart condition. And then, unlike many people who pull strings to get out of military service, he pulled strings, and he had a lot of them, to get in. He has Rockefeller and Sachs and Robert Lehman, another great banker and collector, help him get in. And he starts as a buck private, but then again, with Sachs's help, when this Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives group, which we know as the Monuments Men, is established, Rorimer is a natural. And right after D-Day, he goes to Normandy. And his initial charge is to protect or salvage historic buildings, which is not easy. He wants to get a Jeep to go to the great Cathedral of Mont Saint-Michel. and to make sure that it hasn't been damaged by Allied fire or by Nazi fire. And he tells this to his colonel, who is excoriating. He says, we don't want you to just look at a bunch of medieval stones. That's not why you're here. But soon after that, he goes to Paris and he meets this extraordinary woman. Rose Valland is one of my very favorites in the book. Was an unpaid curator at the Jeu de Paume, this little jewel of a museum in the Tuileries. And through working with her, which was not always easy, she had risked her life time and again, as you know, to pass on information to the resistance about what the Germans were doing in the Jeu de Paume, one of their great storehouses for stolen art, especially modern art. And what he and his fellows begin to realize is the enormity of Nazi art pillaging. And he goes to Buxheim, and this is a man who has, after all, spent his life, his working life at the Met. And he is astonished by the quantity of art he sees, decorative art, tapestries that he had last seen in the houses of the Rothschilds in Paris, which by the time he had gone were denuded. Renoirs, Davids, Delacroix in, again, an incredible quantity. And his first job is to locate the art. And with the help of his fellows and with the intelligence supplied by Rose Valland, he does just that. But then they face a really thorny question. That is, what are they going to do with it? And he's instrumental in setting up a collecting point in Munich to bring stolen art. But that was by no means the end of the challenge. The challenge is, well, who gets the art? To whom are you going to return it? The monuments men understandably wanted to get back to the States. They also lacked extensive local knowledge. So the US government makes a fateful and, in my view, flawed decision, which is to repatriate the art to its country of origin. There's nothing particularly wrong with that, but what it meant is, in the case of Monet's Water Lilies, 1904, you know a lot about that history, Jonathan. It doesn't go back to Paul Rosenberg. It goes back to Paris. And while there is a commission for the recuperation of art, and they achieved pretty good results, by no means are they able to return more than a fraction of art. And that's partly because some of the art was ownerless, which is one of these chilling bureaucratic phrases for art that belonged to people who had been murdered, most often in the camps. Others, dealers or especially collectors, small-time collectors, didn't have the documents. So again, another chilling phrase, where are your papers? And Rorimer goes back to the Metropolitan, and among the things he does is he writes a book with a man named Gilbert Rabin, and the book is called Survival. It's about the protection of salvage of works of art in war. It's an adventure story, but it's a very low-key adventure story because Rorimer, maybe this is one of the reasons you like him, it's certainly one of the reasons I like him, he was a very modest man. He's not painting himself as a hero. He's not maximizing the threats and challenges he and his compatriots faced. But what's interesting about the book is that it's very much a curator's book. He is, of course, aware that the vast majority of the art that he has helped recover and then bring to Munich and to other collecting points has been pillaged by Nazis and collaborators by Jews. But that is underplayed in Survival. It is about the survival of works of art, which, is very understandable given that the man is a curator. He's an art historian. And above all, he wanted to ensure the survival of these works of art. But it's part of a pattern in which, through the fault of no one, and I don't think this was intentional, Jews were almost erased from the story. And Rorimer ultimately flourishes at the museum, and he becomes its director. The first director of Jewish origin, and this was a fact that he played down. In fact, he told his young curator, Henry Geltzeller, Belgian Jewish refugee, if I remember correctly, that to be very careful about not revealing his Jewishness because of the anti-Semitism that was in the Met and was much more intense in the early 20th century when Benjamin Altman ends up bequeathing his collection. And then Rorimer dies suddenly after a board of trustees meeting in which he is viciously attacked. So it's a sad ending to the story of a remarkable man. He's decorated for bravery by the Bronze Star by the United States, the Légion d'honneur by France for his role in retrieving this lost art.
Yeah, the account Thomas Hoving, his successor, gives of that meeting where Summer Redstone, the chairman of the board, attacks him in a way that is anti-Semitic. It is so tragic and upsetting. And as I think about it, and because he's so extraordinary what he does as a monuments officer, as a director of the Met. As you point out in your book, I think it's really kind of touching that when he comes back to the Met after the war, he always wears his army boots there, right? He wears a three-piece suit with his boots. It's like the war experience stays with him in a way, right? It's and for me, I was interested because the person I wrote about in my last book, a Nazi art plunder named Bruno Loza. Loza had befriended one of the curators at the Met, Theodore Rousseau, also a monuments man. But when Loza comes to the Met, Rorimer will not meet with him and will not have anything to do with this old Nazi. And the swashbuckling curators, they have more license and they reach out to these old Nazis more. But Rorimer, he knows boundaries, and there's a probity to him that's really impressive.
It is, and it's a great story you tell about that. And I think that the brown army boots were not a sartorial idiosyncrasy. This is a man who had his suits made in London and Madrid, and the war experience was so fundamental to shaping his view of the world, his view of himself. And I think that what was very striking was the notion that was put forth late in the war, not least by the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight David Eisenhower, was that these great works of art symbolize the civilization that we were fighting for. And those brown army boots were a reminder to those around him that this was a man to be reckoned with. It was a man who had not just spent his life in a museum.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we have a few minutes left. I think I'll turn it over to Benjamin Quinn, our host from the Harvard Bookstore, and see if the audience has questions for you.
Sure. So we have a couple in the queue, and your book is clearly full of so many extraordinary people. We have a question from Lissa Warren, who wants to know if you could tell us a little bit more about, I'm going to say the name wrong, but Abraham Minchin. Lissa wasn't familiar with his work until she read your book, and she'd be so glad to know about him a little more.
So Abraham Minchin is another one of the characters I really fell in love with. He's a Russian Jewish immigrant to Paris at a time that Paris has become a magnet for talented and aspiring artists, intellectuals, would-be bohemians. He comes to Paris and he is trying to make his mark, and he is forever chasing Chaim Soutine, who is about maybe 5 or 6 years older, but is already well established in the art world, another Russian Jew. And if you look at Minchin's early work, one of the things which is fascinating about it is you see the specter of Soutine in it. He is a man with a wife and a young daughter. There's a very touching picture of Minchin with his baby daughter. And he's trying to provide for them, and it's very, very difficult. And he provides for them really by sacrificing himself, by limiting his own intake of food and his own spending. In any case, he is taken up by one of the leading characters in the book, Parisian art dealer René Gampel, whose father, Ernest, was Nathan Wildenstein's partner. And in 1918, the Gampels and the Wildensteins part ways. René Gampel was not someone who said much publicly about his Jewishness. He was much affected by the Dreyfus affair, certainly affected by the signs he saw in American hotels in the early 20th century, like "No Jews, no dogs." But he's not someone who's immersed in Jewish culture. But when he meets Minchin, but he's already bought his paintings, and he's convinced that this man is going to be a genius who will do great works, and he'll be one of the titans of the age. And he takes Minchin to the Louvre, and it'd be impossible to really underestimate the enthusiasm that this young artist has, that all of a sudden he's in this palace of marvels, the like of which was as distant as he could be from the small town in Russia that he came from. And Gampel becomes a kind of artistic tutor, artistic educator, as well as his patron and supporter. He's very tough on Minchin at times, and Minchin wants that kind of criticism. He wants to get better. He's full of aspiration. He is full of ambition, but he becomes very ill. And while working on his art, he suddenly dies. And for Gampel, this is a tragedy. And he says, for the world, this is a tragedy. And there's a remarkable photograph of Abraham Minchin. He's wearing a suit. He's a young man. He's smiling. He has his arms out, and he's in the middle of a bridge in Paris, full of expectation, full of hope, taking in the glories of the city, hoping to make his mark. And in a way, that bridge is a symbol of what almost all of the Jewish art dealers, collectors, critics, art historians, and not least artists that I write about are thinking about. This is the bridge to European high culture, to social acceptance, to making their mark in the world. And he dies in the early 1930s. And he has no way of knowing that what's on the other side of that bridge is not belonging, but betrayal, this violent onslaught by the Nazis and the dispossession of his works. I wish his works were better known. They deserve to be.
So we're a bit short on time, so I'm going to get to this question. And if we have time left over after you answer, we can maybe have time for one more. But this person asks, your book talks about the Nazi plundering, but in the final chapters. I loved reading this book because it remembers the people from whom the work was stolen, introducing us to a community whose specificity has largely been erased. Do you think this act of remembrance is its own form of restitution?
That's a really interesting question. I've actually just finished writing a short essay about the relationship between remembrance and restitution. So I think, as we all know, in the last 20 or so years, there has been a resurgence of interest in the fate of Nazi stolen art. And there have been concerted efforts by families with the aid of Jewish communal organizations and also with the aid of the American government in certain cases to recapture art, which in some cases was an extraordinarily difficult thing to do for many, many reasons. And I am fully supportive of this cause of restitution, though it has to be said that ownership can be a very, very murky business when you're talking about works of art with muddy provenance, and it raises a lot of complex legal, moral, and aesthetic questions. But I think restitution is not a substitute for remembrance. That is, at certain times I have felt that there has been too much emphasis, understandable as it is, on returning stolen works, and that is perfectly appropriate in terms of the ways in which these works become symbols of family pride, Jewish ties, the history of families, and what actually happened to them. But what I've tried to do in this book, by turning the story of Nazi stolen art on its head, is to recreate the lives and works of the dealers and collectors who love this art and lost this art, to restore them in their humanity, which the Nazis tried to take away from them. So this is not an either or. In an ideal world, remembrance would be a spur to restitution, and restitution would lead us back to trying to remember and to understand the lives and works of these extraordinary people who contributed so much, not only to the world of the masters, but especially to the triumph of modern art.
Wonderful. So we can have just one more quick question and then we can end it. But so we have just a simple question. What was the most surprising thing you came across in your research on this project?
Aside from how long it took. Well, I think that perhaps the most surprising thing was an interview I had in the late 1990s, well before I was thinking of writing this project, with Elaine Rosenberg. My wife and I had been in Boston and had talked our way into the Monet in the 20th Century show at the Museum of Fine Arts, one of these great blockbuster shows curated by Paul Hayes Tucker, among others. And what drew us there was number 27, Water Lilies 1904, which was signed by Monet in red paint. It wasn't the grandest or the greatest picture in the show, but it was surely the most controversial, because what emerged in the course of the show, in part thanks to work done by a unit in London, and in part the great work done by Walter Robinson of the Spotlight team of the Boston Globe, was that this was stolen art. And there was a major dispute at the MFA, which I don't have time to go into, but is worth looking at carefully, because we have another dispute currently at the MFA and also one at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I decided to write to Mrs. Rosenberg, and she was the daughter-in-law of Paul Rosenberg. Her husband, Alexandra, was the namesake of Paul's father, who had founded the gallery. And Alexandra played a really important role in this story in capturing the art train that the Nazis were sending their spoils from Paris across the Rhine. And she became the guardian of the Rosenberg memory, if you will. And I wanted to talk to her about the family. And I went to see her one day in Manhattan, walking down Madison Avenue, past a building that I've walked down as early as I can remember. And we went in to talk. She was obviously a very charming, smart woman. And everything was going very well until she said, "Mr. Delllheim, would you please remind me of your topic?" And at that point, I thought I would be brief for once. And I said, "Jewish art dealers." And Mrs. Rosenberg smile disappeared. And she said rather sternly to me, "I am not going to talk to you. I do not want to talk about Jewish art dealers." And I'm not exactly sure what her concern was. Perhaps it was a little bit like Philip Roth's concern of not wanting to be called a Jewish writer, wanting to be called an American writer. And I certainly understood that. But I think it was a fear that if her attempts to recover the art that had been pillaged from her late father-in-law was considered to be a Jewish cause, that it would not go well. But in the course of the conversation, I explained myself a little bit more and talked about what I was looking for. She was incredibly generous and helpful and gave me so many insights into the Rosenbergs, the Wildensteins, the world in which they lived and worked. And at the end of the interview, she got up and she turned to me and said, "Mr. Delheim, you have seduced me." Not literally, I might add, but I felt much the same way. And that was probably the biggest surprise, just because I thought this was going to be a straightforward interview. And thanks to Mrs. Rosenberg, it turned out to be something much more. And I know she passed away about a year ago. She was a remarkable, remarkable human being.
You know, I had my own little element to that story. I went to see her the week before the exhibition opened at the MFA Boston, and I brought a copy of my first book, Art as Politics in the Third Reich, and I was working in their archives, and she and her assistant went through my book, and they found the illustration of the Monet that you mentioned, and it had been stolen by Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, and it had been restituted to France, as you related earlier, and it had become one of those MNRs, the airless works in a provincial museum, and that was loaned to Boston, to the MFA. And so it felt good to be a little piece in this whole puzzle that we identified, you know, what work they had, what it had gone to the Nazi leader, it had been restituted, and so it led to a restitution there. But I had the same impression of Mrs. Elaine Rosenberg too, that she was really an extraordinary person. So thank you, Charles, for
Thank
today.
you, Jonathan.
Yeah. And thank you both for this fantastic conversation. Thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your afternoon with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase Belonging and Betrayal at harvard.com. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy your weekend, everyone. Keep reading and stay safe. Thank you both again so much. This was such a pleasure.
Thanks so much. It was a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate the opportunity, Benjamin and Jonathan. Hats off to you. There's no one I'd rather talk to about these things.
Thank you, Charles.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.